All right, hello everyone, and welcome to another NAGDA Connect conversation. My name is Matt Peterson. I'm NAGDA's Executive Director. Today, we're going to take a deeper dive into some research from our partners at the Employee Benefits Research Institute, or EBRI. They did a study using our PRRL database, which we'll talk more about in a minute, what that is, to tease out some of the differences in saving behaviors between men and women in the public sector. So important stuff. Joining me today for this important conversation are researchers from EBRI, Simita Tepasit and Craig Copeland. So welcome to you both. Glad to have you here. So before we dig in, I mentioned the Public Retirement Research Lab. It's a partnership between NAGDA and EBRI that we've had for the last several years. It's the PRRL, we call it the PRRL. Before we get into the study, some of our members may not be familiar with what PRRL is. Simita, can you describe the database a little bit, how the partnership works, and what it looks like right now in the current database?
Yeah, of course. I love any chance, any opportunity to talk about Pearl. Pearl is a collaboration between NAGDA and EBRI that collects the participant level data from public sector DC plans and publish research that provide insights on how public sector savers are behaving. The first year of data that was collected is as of year end 2019, and the latest one is as of year end 2023. And that year, the data consists of 248 plans, 2.7 million participants, and roughly about 164 million billion dollars in assets. Um, and while 40% of those 248 plans cover the city workers, over 80% of the participants actually belong to state plans. And most of these plans are 457Bs, 401As. We have both mandatory and voluntary contribution plans. Um, we're currently finishing up the 2024 cross-sectional analysis, and hopefully, we aim to publish a result in the second quarter. In addition to that, the data collection for the year in 2025 data is in progress.
Okay, so a big partnership, as Samita mentioned, a lot of city plans, a lot of the individuals are from the state. Those tend to be our bigger plans, but we do have a very broad range of plans from across the spectrum, state, universities, all the way down to transportation districts. So for our members, if you haven't agreed to join into the Pearl database, contribute your data, it does provide the engine for research like this so that we can better understand what's going on in the public sector. We would much appreciate your participation. So one of the benefits of the Pearl is that it provides us with individual level data. So it goes beyond just the means and medians at the plan level. So it lets us tease out some of the details that aren't apparent from our plan level data sets. So one piece of information that we've had from the beginning, and we actually have quite a bit of demographic information on our participants, is gender. So that's provided us the ability to complete a couple of studies. So we've done a couple of studies on the differences between male and female savers, and we've seen some consistencies. We are doing some analysis right now on a most recent study. Samita, can you talk about the details of the most recent study that we've been working on, what you're seeing, and then a little bit of what you're finding in those numbers?
Yeah. Similar to other studies that we've seen out there, our study shows that female participants have lower account balances, contribution amount, contribution rates when compared to the male participants. This trend holds when we control for age, tenure, salary. For example, the average account balance for women in their 40s is about $41,000. That compared to $68,000 for male. When we look at the contribution rate among female participants who make between $60,000 to $80,000 a year, that contribution rate is 5.3% compared to 6.5 for male in the same income group.
Okay. So I think one of the things we kind of default to when we talk about savings differences between male and female, we often go to things like salary or age or tenure as explainers for why we see different behavior. But what I have found very fascinating in these data is that when you control for those things, when you have the same tenure, when you have the same salary, same ages, you're still seeing those differences, right? It hasn't those things we might have kind of intuitively thought of as explainers haven't held up. We're still seeing the same behaviors even when we control for that stuff. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. When we control for those things, we see the same thing with female participants having lower account balances, lower contribution amount, contribution rates.
Okay. Craig, anything you want to add on that point?
No, I think the one thing the next thing is I think what we're going to talk about too is the types of plans they're in and the types of occupations. And I think that's the next level that we need to go to. And I think Samita has some analysis and thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, and that's it's one of the things that I've spent some time thinking about is it is it public sector? Are there reasons in the public sector that this might be happening? I will say this is consistent with what we've seen in the private sector from other studies, not obviously those done by us, but it does seem that it is fairly consistent. Balances, contributions, those kind of things are lower in the private sector. In the public sector, the dynamic is a little different. Looking at BLS data, so most recent BLS data, the workforce in the United States is pretty much split 50-50. In the public sector, it's about 58% female. So I think this question is really relevant for our population, especially. And if you dig down a little bit into different career fields, you'll see that things like hospitals, schools, education, they're more like 70% female, while things like utilities, transportation tend to be much heavier male, more like 25 or 30% female. I don't know if it doesn't seem like from what we've seen that that's really an explainer. I mean, we're getting a little away from this study. Obviously, we don't have data into those specific occupations. But Samita, I think when we start to think about what's driving some of these behaviors, that's where I go. It doesn't seem like that is necessarily a driver, but what else have you seen from the data or from the public sector in general that may be some reasons behind the numbers?
You raise really good points. Just wanted you know that. But I think also several factors that I think contribute to these trends. For example, males tend to act more like a primary savers in the family, while females usually are supplemental savers. We're looking into, just because you brought up the BLS, we are also looking into the potential job occupations based on who the plan serves. So, for example, if the plan is serving a school district, most participants are likely teachers, who tend to be female. So, hopefully, this analysis can help us better understand participants' savings behavior. In addition to that, female participants are also more likely to engage in mandatory plan. Um, these plans typically receive lower contribution rate and sometimes even cap. So that might explain the lower account balances.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting. You mentioned that before. I thought that was an interesting fact, just to see that there was a little heavier in the mandatory plans, were a little more heavily female. Craig, anything you want to add on some speculation to what may be driving these differences in the public sector?
Well, one of the things that's been found overall is the is people aren't effectively using matches. So between couples, and if the female is a supplementary saver, they may be losing out on a match if it's there. So therefore, there really needs to be a better coordination with that. And I think that's something we talk about. What plan sponsors need to be thinking about. We talk about that later. Is really how people are using that to make sure that they're maximizing their savings if they get rid of this supplemental primary saver issue and really maximize what you can across all families. And I think it's important to really think about what's going on there and what's available to that. And I think some of the unique things to the public sector that they have the ability to be able to help people uh, take it to that next level. They just need more understanding of what is available to them.
Yeah, that's a great point. And when we're, there's an advantage to Pearl in that we can look at individual data. I think somewhat the disadvantage is that we're not looking at that whole household, right? And there is that dynamic of you think about these things as a household. I will give a quick plug for our part of our partnership with Pearl and EBRI also has a component that connects to JP Morgan's data. And so the research that Sharon Carson and Mike Conrath have done from JP Morgan has actually shown some results at the household spending and debt and spending shocks. So that'll be part of our conference again this year. Be on the lookout for those. But with the Pearl data specifically, when we're looking at individuals, there is a little bit of that blind spot there of, how does this fit into the broader household dynamic, which I think is really important. So we've talked about balances and we've talked about contribution levels. One of the other things that has been very interesting to me as we've looked at differences in the ways that gender affects the way that people use their defined contribution account is in the investments. And so this study found that males are more likely to hold equity funds like the S&P 500 or like an S&P 500 fund. But the differences are a little bit nuanced. Can you talk about what you've seen on the investment front?
Yeah. So female participants, what we find, are more inclined to use TDF in their plan, as compared to male who are more likely to invest directly in asset class specific funds like equity funds or stable value funds. Um, for example, female participants have 33% of their total asset invest in the TDFs as compared to 24% in the male participants. Um, when we look at the male participants, 50% of their total asset is in equity funds compared to 42% among female participants. And when we look at this by age group, tenures, salary, contribution types, it's the same, which is female are more inclined to use TDF and male are more inclined to use asset class specific. Um, However, when the equity portion of the TDF combined with the equity funds directly, the total equity exposure between male and female are pretty much the same. So it's interesting how they get there the same way. They just get there differently. And the analysis also show we did look into default investments to see if it plays a role in people's decision. And we find that even in plans that default into stable value funds, for example, female participants show a greater preference to TDF with 14% of their assets still in TDF as compared to 8% in male participants. And when we look into plans that default into TDFs, male participants still prefer to use asset class specific, specifically equity funds at 45% compared with 34% in female participants in those plans.
Yeah, I thought those findings were just fascinating. So there's probably some potential side effects there, right? There's some nuanced kind of outcomes that will happen because of those different behaviors. So can you talk about at least on the equity exposure side, how that might affect the participants differently, even though they're showing kind of similar levels of an equity exposure?
Yeah, I think there's two potential side effects specifically for the male participants. Since female participants typically use TDF in their accounts, which rebalance automatically, shifting from more aggressive, you know, equity based to more income producing assets as they get closer to retirement age. But male participants don't have that. They're gonna have to reallocate their account on their own, which possibly leaving them overexposed to equity as they get older. I personally don't rebalance my account all that often. I don't think people do. And that's one of the side effects I could think of. The second one is less diversification within equities. TDFs, for example, or other funds that are investing in multiple asset classes, invest in ranges of equity funds from domestic, international, small, medium, large, you name it. But our analysis shows that male participants with less than 50% of their total asset in TDFs, 40% of their total asset is in large cap domestic equity. And when you compare that to the large cap domestic equity investment in TDF, which is only 25 to 30%, it's depending on like, what TDF and how aggressive it is, it's just much more exposed to one specific type of equities
Yeah,
rather as compared to TDFs.
that's a great point. And you sometimes we get into a mindset of just these being somewhat the same, right? But very much not. If you're just buying an S&P 500 fund, you're buying a very narrow part of the equities market. Craig, anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I think it's important because I'm doing the S&P 500 in the last 5 to 10 years has been good, but it's not likely to still outperform going forward. So if we don't take advantage of the allocations within equities into the different types, there's a lot of people projecting that international is going to do better in the next 5, 10 years than domestic equities. So if people aren't taking advantage of all the equities potential returns out there, they're missing out on some by not being as well diversified, not just, between bonds and equities and stable value, but within the equities.
Yeah, great point. And then you worry about getting into things like chasing returns and all of the behaviors that something like a target date fund is designed to prevent. So we're getting close to our time limit here. So I did want to ask one more question, and it's our favorite question for our folks. At the end of the day, we talk about this stuff so that our members can do something, can take the information and think about it and process it. So I think this has been pretty consistent, right? We've seen this trend over a couple of studies with PRRL. What can plan sponsors do with this information? What would you say are some concrete steps maybe that they can think about when they're thinking about how this can affect their plan? Samit, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I'd say it's very important for you guys to get to know your demographics and who you guys are serving. Um, for example, if you are serving male dominated field like utility, you're gonna have to think about the investment lineup's gonna have to be different. They prefer, as we've seen in this research, they prefer to invest directly in asset class specific funds. So they're gonna need some variety of options so that they don't just invest in large cap domestic equity and a combination of that with stable value funds. And as compared to female participants who prefer TDF. So TDFs should also be options for female dominated area like hospitals. And the way you communicate with your audience is also going to have to be different. Um, in communicating the difference between equity funds, I think is very important. Large caps, small caps are not the same. International, global, domestics are not the same. It's the educational materials will need to be clear on what they are. Rebalancing, we mentioned that. A reminder might help with male dominated field who's getting matched. I think Craig mentioned this, and I'll have him, cover that. But ex going over like the matching program could help participants understand better of what they should do rather than designated someone in the family to be primary saver and supplemental saver, but actually take advantage of the full match.
Great. Craig, anything you want to add?
Well, yeah, just like as Samita pointed out, is that are you a supplemental saver versus are you a primary? And say make sure that there's a way that you can maximize your total savings by taking advantage of the match in your plan. But also going from there is to also understand whether you're a supplemental plan, you may want to have a different investment strategy from someone where it's the primary mandatory plan. You may have a different because if you have a strong DB plan, you may feel more comfortable taking on more risk in your defined contribution plan. So you really need to make sure that people understand that these benefits work together and how you can maximize the use and take advantage of, well, I already have some level of guaranteed income I'm going to get from my DB plan, so I may be able to take more risk in my DC plan. But if I don't have that, then I better really think about how I can make sure I can get that, so I get that level of comfort that I have some basic, I'll have some basic income in retirement. And that really becomes another thing to think about. It's not just one of these plans, but it should be thinking about all your benefits together. And anything else, if you're offering an HSA, how do you coordinate contributions to all those? Because, if you get people to allow to invest in HSA, then that's another place that you should be thinking about coordinating all these benefits going into their retirement. So you really need to make sure that you're showing them where all the money you can put and how that can work out better versus, just looking at one particular benefit in isolation.
Yeah, great points. So if I was to summarize, I would say know your demographics first, and there are some trends in the public sector. It's probably fairly obvious to those of you who are in those types of plans. If you are in a hospital or if you are in education, probably more female dominated. If you are in a utility, maybe cops and fire, it's a little more male dominated. And then understanding and being able to communicate the whole scenario, which is a very complex scenario in the public sector. Social Security is different. DB plans are different across the spectrum, and what role the DC plans plays is important to synthesize for somebody, and not only in the context of the individual, but in the context of the household. So a lot to do. Hopefully this gives you a little bit to think about as you approach those conversations, those very complex conversations with your participants. But that's all the time we have for today. Check out the study, give it a read, check out all the stuff. PRRL.org has all of the research that we've done, that Craig and Samita have done over the years. We very much appreciate our partnership with EBRI. So thank you both for coming on to the program, and thank you all for tuning in. Have a great day.